been fighting ISIL, trying to clear terrorists from areas close to the border.
That is our Michal Bardavit reporting today, and that's also all the time we have now for Asia Today. Thank you for your company, and goodbye from Beijing.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
We strongly advise ROK not to pursue this course of action. Otherwise, they will only end up hurting themselves as well as others.
Despite China's strong opposition, South Korea has proceeded with THAAD deployment, which was argued for by the US at the UN Security Council. What will be the implications? In reaction to the biggest ever joint military exercise between the US and ROK, the DPRK has fired 4 ballistic missiles into the sea off Japan's northwest. What further security uncertainties will this bring to the situation? Rounds of joint military exercises between Japan and the US have taken place since Trump took office. How will the US-Japan alliance develop? With the US out of the TPP agreement, some countries are hoping that China will take up the responsibility. How will China's leadership role develop in global affairs such as this?
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, has fired 4 ballistic missiles into the sea off Japan's northwest, coming after Seoul and Washington kicked off their joint field training exercise, Full Eagle, on March the 1st. With the death of Kim Jong-un's half-brother in Malaysia and political turmoil in the ROK, there are many political uncertainties and risks in the Asia-Pacific region. Today, to discuss these issues and more, I'm honored to have an exclusive interview with Mr. Michael Green, Japan Chair and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies with Georgetown University. That's the topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much.
Which should we trust most? The presidency of the White House or the president on the Twitter? Because we face a lot of uncertainties concerning how to shape the American foreign policy, particularly the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century. Which should we trust?
Well, I think you can have a lot of trust and a lot of confidence in the institutions of the United States, in public opinion in the United States, in the U.S. Congress, in the U.S. government, in state governors, among whom there's a very broad consensus that the U.S. should be engaged in the world. A majority of Americans in public opinion polls say that Asia is the most important region to us. A majority of Americans say free trade is important. So Donald Trump has taken some positions in Twitter and in the campaign trail that are provocative and shocking, and politically quite useful for him, because he's been able to change the news media attention on a day-to-day basis by using Twitter to create a new story. It is very disruptive in terms of foreign policy and domestic American society and politics, but it is not policy. And the policy direction, I think, will largely remain the same over the future, because the American public's view and the view of critical American institutions.
Michael, you know, we are coming to terms with the domestic politics of the United States, and increasingly so. This is part of the painful learning curve for China,
Sure.
as you are a democracy. However, what you said is correct. It makes sense. However, your president, Mr. Donald Trump, seems to be at war with all of these things you have said. The establishment, the media, the public opinions, the Congress. And he's currently even at war with his predecessors. I mean, what do you think of the ambiguity? How can we clarify some parts of his foreign policy?
Well, Donald Trump is the first populist to actually become elected and become president in American history. Populists like him often attack the establishment. They attack everybody. They tell the American people, you got a bad deal. I'm going to get you a better deal because China's ripping us off. Japan's ripping us off. Europe's ripping us off. The banks are ripping us off. At a time like this, where in every country there are questions about globalization, including in China, that kind of message actually is quite powerful in a campaign. But to run the government and to represent your country in foreign affairs, you cannot fight everybody, which is why Donald Trump reconfirmed the One China policy, reconfirmed security commitments to Japan. Step by step, he's going to have to choose what he really wants to fight for. The uncertainty may remain for a while, but I think that the reality of American interests and American public opinion about the world and the reality of a country like China or Europe or Japan is going to put him back generally on the trajectory of his predecessors. He's not a politician. He likes to use Twitter. That's different. There's going to be surprises. Every day, there's going to be some new question. That's new. But the general direction, I don't think he's going to change or be able to change because of what the American people and what the key American institutions say.
However, you either have a strong man or a strong president with a weak team or the other way around. In the case of Donald Trump, I'm afraid he's got a very unique team like James Mattis, Bannon, Rex Tillerson. These guys are not stupid. So do you think the presidency would be gradually shaped by the wisdom of these guys who are very hostile to China, at least on the campaign trail?
I don't think, I'll answer your question on North Korea too, but I don't think that hostile China policy will be the main driver or main theme for this administration. And I'll tell you why. The Pentagon thinks that the #1 challenge to the U.S. security interests right now comes from Russia because of the danger of military action in the Eastern European area, and from North Korea because of the nuclear missiles. The next thing they would tell you is ISIS. We will always be fighting ISIS. And then Iran, which is going to expand its navy and expand its power. And all of these are dangerous. I don't think that the Pentagon is telling Donald Trump the U.S.-China relationship is dangerous. Yes, there are going to be tensions over the South China Sea and other areas. But I think their view of China is this is a more gradual and unfolding problem. It's a long-term challenge, and there are many areas of cooperation. So I don't think a hostile China policy will be the main characteristic of Trump's foreign policy. And as we were discussing earlier, as a populist, you can fight everybody as a candidate. But when you're governing, you have to choose your priorities. And I think the so-called China threat is not going to be one of the top 3 or 4.
Let's take a closer
North Korea will, by the way. North Korea will.
One follow-up question about the DPRK. A second look at the worst-case scenario between the ROK and China will be devastating consequences arising from the deployment of THAAD in ROK, despite the unofficial punishment of Lloyd, one of the major South Korean conglomerates in the Chinese market. The South Korean authorities seem ready to deploy and go ahead with the missile shield program, and China feels strongly that it's going to be a major threat to our effort to keep the what we call the MAD policy, the mutually assured destruction or policy of balance across the 38th parallel.
So if I know you're interviewing me, but if I can ask you to help me answer the question better, what is the threat from THAAD to the so-called MAD or nuclear deterrent of China? What's the concern?
Well, this is an interview, and of course you are in a better position to address these concerns. You are more authoritative as an expert of security studies in Northeast Asia. So China feels that our missiles might be threatened with a THAAD that can easily detect our maneuvers. That's the Chinese concern.
So the first thing I would say is that the United States should always take China's concerns seriously. China should always take U.S. concerns seriously. If major powers like the United States and China are going to avoid conflict and expand cooperation, we can't dismiss each other's concerns.
Because we don't trust each other strategically.
Well, you know, there's a curious mix of friendship and rivalry, of trust in some areas and deep mistrust in other areas. And THAAD is clearly one area where there's deep mistrust. The capabilities of THAAD are limited. For example, the radar can see fairly far, but so can satellites in space. That's not new. The missile can intercept certain missiles, but China's Dongfang 21 missiles have a very long range and can easily, from other parts of China, bypass that. But I understand it is a concern for China. What I would say about it from a U.S. perspective is this. Number one, the U.S. decision to deploy THAAD and ask South Korea for permission to deploy THAAD has almost nothing to do with China. It is about the growing North Korea threat of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. When I was in the Bush administration, over 8 years, North Korea conducted 1 nuclear test. They've conducted 5 tests and multiple missile tests. The exact military threat from the North Korean chemical, biological, nuclear weapons and their missiles, biological, by the way, which they used in Myanmar to kill Kim Jong-nam, that's very real.
Not Myanmar, Malaysia.
Excuse me, thank you, in Malaysia. That's very real, it's very threatening, and any U.S. president has an obligation to defend our boys and girls, our men and women who are in Korea to help defend Korea. There is no way that any president would say, we're going to pull back THAAD and leave our guys exposed because it upsets China. So
what you're saying actually suggests clearly that the deployment of THAAD aims to protect American men and women in uniform in the ROK instead of the Seoul capital.
It is primarily to defend U.S. forces because it's an American system being deployed near a major American base. But from South Korea's perspective, there's no way that a South Korean president can say to the United States, thank you very much for sending your young men and women here to defend us, but you cannot have a shield to defend them against North Korean missiles. So the reality is this. China's position is very strongly felt. Media covers it extensively. There is no way that the U.S. president is going to say, we're pulling back THAAD. And it is very unlikely, I think, that the South Korean president, including the next president, will say, please take away THAAD. So the reality is we're heading towards something of a collision course. And the question is, can the Trump administration, can Jun Yong-hai and President Xi put this in the right context and realize this is one of the areas where we disagree, but we have to agree to disagree. Another one may be the South China Sea.
Michael, short term, the deployment of THAAD is immediate threat to our security in China. However, long term, rewriting the pacifist constitution in Japan would be something very serious for China to consider. The latest political gesture from LDP in Liberal Democratic Party in Japan says that Mr. Shinzo Abe is likely to be the prime minister or head of their party for a 3rd term. Right. That means that he will have enough time to write the constitution despite strong opposition from within. What do you think of China's concerns? Because the security pact between Tokyo and Washington is allegedly to lay groundwork and the cornerstone for the regional security. But China says, no, we don't trust Japan, particularly after Shinzo Abe and his team said over and over, we don't want to apologize again. Every sign suggested that they are not very serious about the war crimes.
Right. Well, on THAAD, I actually think that one THAAD battery is a small pin compared to the overwhelming missile capabilities of the PLA. But this is an area where the U.S. and China, and maybe you and I, will agree to disagree. On Japan, it's very interesting. I lived in Japan 5 years. I know Prime Minister Abe very well, having worked in the Japanese Diet when I was younger. Japan has become more and more concerned about the North Korean threat, about China's rise, and the Japanese public has supported some incremental increases in Japan's capabilities, closer security relations with the U.S., what some people would call a more realist approach to great power relations and defense policy. And that's one trend. But what the other trend is also important, which is the Japanese people believe that the pacifist constitution is one of the reasons why there's no war. So I think Mr. Abe found there was quite strong support in Japan for increasing defense cooperation and even changing some of the interpretations of Article 9. But at the same time, there's a very strong headwind from the Japanese public saying, we still value Article 9, and we still want some confidence that the basic pacifist nature of Japan won't change. So Prime Minister Abe calls his policy proactive contribution to peace. In other words, while many in the Liberal Democratic Party and many intellectuals would like someday to change the Constitution, it was written by Americans. If you read it in Japanese, it sounds very strange. On the other hand, the Japanese people, while they want Japan to have closer defense ties with the U.S., more defense capabilities, they want that kind of reassurance that comes from having the pacifist constitution. So I don't think it will be changed so easily. I think this is much longer term.
Do you think you have gone to great length in explaining the essence of one of your books, Reluctant Realism of Japanese Politics? What do you mean by reluctant realism?
So I wrote that, thank you for citing my book. I wrote that published it in 2001. And looking at the 1990s and post-Cold War Japanese foreign policy, including with China. And what I argued was the Japanese people and politicians for the post-war period enjoyed a kind of comfortable position where they would focus on economic growth and avoid a kind of power competition in their relations in Asia. But because the economy slowed down and because China became more powerful and because the North Korean threat became more serious, the Japanese people became more realist, which means more attentive to balance of power and security. But they were reluctant because the pacifist culture in Japan is also quite strong. And I think this sort of back and forth between the strong pacifist culture and a realism or recognition that Asia is becoming more dangerous, this will be the kind of interaction.
Sorry, Michael, I have to go back to you in 1 minute. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Michael Green, a very senior security advisor in Washington, D.C., a think tank with Georgetown University, and also author of Japan Chair, talking about reluctant realism. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us.
CGTN shows you more, providing a fresh global voice you can trust.
And a different look at the world you won't find anywhere else.
We offer unparalleled coverage of Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
We present diverse perspectives on news and newsmakers from around the world.
We want to engage our viewers with stories that represent the complete picture.
We want to share with you ideas that matter to us all.
The stories, the people, the issues.
A new and balanced perspective.
CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. So do you think China is ready to fill in the vacuum as the regional leader?
Do the Chinese people want China to fill in the vacuum and be the regional leader? I think still there's some hesitation on the part of the Chinese people.
Perhaps we have been misunderstood because what China stands for is to be inclusive, to usher in co-prosperity instead of adopting the zero-sum game that was so popular during the Cold War.
We don't want that. You're absolutely right. During the Cold War, the United States traded less than 1% of all of its trade with the Soviet Union, much less. Today, U.S.-China trade is 15, 16% and growing of U.S. trade. It's a very different situation. We want, I think, ultimately, a situation where you can have a TPP or Trans-Pacific Trade Arrangement and also RCEP within Asia, and ultimately they merge towards some free trade area of the Asia-Pacific with a set of rules and transparency that are comfortable for the U.S. or Japan or more developed countries, but beneficial to China because it helps with reform and opening and economic development. That's sort of the convergence of these different visions. President Xi mentioned that at APEC when China hosted. President Bush and President Obama talked about that. We're off that track a little bit right now because the U.S. president has opposed TPP.
But do you think TPP is actually useful for China? Because it warns China of intellectual property violations as well as telling China that you got to take a second look at the reform of SOE, because no serious partners in the West would like China to have such a strong presence of the SOE in our national economy. But many in China are quite skeptical about the intent of TPP, saying that is intended to reject China's participation.
No, you know, the leaders in APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, agreed in Australia in 2007 that RCEP or TPP or China, Korea, Japan, trilateral, all of these should lead towards a Asia-Pacific-wide free trade agreement. And that's what President Xi said in his speech when China hosted APEC, and that's what mainstream American businesses and congressional officials believe, even though our president right now is skeptical. Is TPP good for China? In the long run, I think so, and the reason is this. The World Bank issued a very famous report warning that China could be stuck in what's called the middle income trap. It's very hard for countries to move up the development ladder, to move from manufacturing, assembly, and export to innovation and systems integration. And TPP actually could be something that helps China. You know, when China joined the World Trade Organization, that helped to spur internal reforms and opening that contributed enormously to China's growth. And I think TPP has the potential to set a kind of standard, and it puts some pressure on China, but it also motivates the Chinese side to begin moving up its economic system to get out of that so-called middle income trap. So TPP, yes, on the one hand, it puts pressure on China. On the other hand, that's pressure that could benefit China. And so, does China want to lead in Asia? I think China has so many domestic issues that...
You raise a very good question about whether China is willing and ready to assume the leadership during the American absence from Asia-Pacific region in terms of TPP. But let's look at Russia. Now, pending investigations into contact with Russia, Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, has resigned over the scandal. Right. To what degree do you think our deep, comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia would be undermined due to President Donald Trump's enormous efforts to get close to Moscow, despite the widespread skeptical views and scrutiny of the American media and the lawmakers there?
So on TPP, quickly, the U.S. made a mistake. And Donald Trump scored what's called in soccer an onside goal. We kicked the ball into our own goal. But there's no vacuum. And in fact, the U.S. economy now is quite strong in comparison to Europe or Japan. China's own economic forecast is down a little bit, we heard in the NPC. So we made a mistake on TPP. The president made a mistake. But I think the U.S. economy is strong and our engagement is strong. And I wouldn't call it a vacuum. Now, on Russia, Donald Trump was the anti-establishment candidate. And the Republican establishment overwhelmingly is suspicious of Russia. And by the way, if you look at opinion polls, so are the American people. So Donald Trump picked around him some people who are a little bit on the fringe, who say, no, we should have good relations with Russia. And he himself clearly wants to have a good relationship with President Putin. And some people even said, well, Trump's strategy might be to use the Russia card against China and against ISIS.
Or to influence the electoral process in the campaign.
Or to influence the electoral process. On using Russia card against China or ISIS, I don't think that that's going to be a key foreign policy strategy. And Moscow knows that, which is why the Russians are being quite tough now with the U.S. again. In terms of the domestic dimension, we've never had anything like this where another country tried to interfere in our election process. I don't think the Russians thought that they could change the outcome. I think they thought Hillary Clinton would win. And what they wanted to do is create some doubt in the American system. Did she really get elected? To create some chaos. This is exactly what Russia has done in elections in Europe. And it's a very serious problem and a very serious threat that most Americans recognize is a major obstacle to improve U.S.-Russia relations. Now, does it affect the Trump administration? In some ways, yes. Politically, this is a kind of a drag or a weight on President Trump. Will it lead to scandals and impeachment? I don't know. this is sort of a daily news in the United States. It's very exciting.
But what's going to happen to the relationship between Russia and other major European powers in the election year? President Trump obviously took side with those who call for the independence of foreign policy like the UK from continental Europe. He encouraged the Brexit campaign, and he's a good friend of Mr. Farage, leader of the British movement for independence. So some politicians in the far-right movement of France clearly said they would love to lift economic sanctions against Russia once they were to win the campaign. Now, do you think this would be a major concern? Do you think that will help reinforce the Russian hand?
Yes, it is a major concern, and European capitals are very concerned, and the Congress is very concerned. Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, very concerned. Mike Pence, the Vice President, has said he's very concerned. The fact that President Trump has not said anything has raised eyebrows, but the broad view of the public and the Congress and the administration is what Russia has been doing, not just in our election, but in European elections, is deeply disturbing. Parts of Mr. Trump's political movement include some very strong anti-Europe, anti-East Coast establishment thinkers like Mr. Bannon, Steve Bannon. And in fact, in the history of so-called isolationism in the United States, very often before World War II, for example, there were intellectuals or members of Congress who distrusted Europe and disliked the East Coast establishment, which had such close ties to Europe. So we have this history in American politics. Today, however, compared to the 1930s, it's a very narrow and quite fringe element in American political life. And I think if not next year, if not this year, sooner or later, it will go away. But for now, it's there, and European leaders are concerned, but I think it's going to go away.
All of these uncertainties, Michael, I'm afraid, have taken place in what we call the post-order, post-West, post-truth era, and that has truly worried our European friends and American observers. And when you look at what China will do as a host of both the BRICS summit and the Belt and Road Initiative summit in China, the two major diplomatic events in this year, you are in a good position to question what Russia and China will jointly achieve.
I'm not very worried.
You're not worried?
I'm not very worried. I don't think most Americans or Europeans.
And do you think there's any legitimacy about the post-West, post-order era?
You know,
is the subject matter of the Munich Security Conference interesting enough for you?
It was certainly interesting. I don't think we're in a post-West world. You know, the Bretton Woods system that was created after World War II principally by the US and Europe, but including all countries, including China, through the WTO and so forth, that Bretton Woods system, it's shaken a little bit by some of the anti-globalization politics, but it's fundamentally very strong. And what President Xi is proposing with the AIIB or the One Belt and Road, it's actually quite small compared to the entirety of the Bretton Woods system. And if China wants to modify the Bretton Woods system, play a larger role, and use AIIB or One Belt One or OBR to do that, that's not necessarily bad for the US. In fact, it could be a positive contribution. But if the Chinese side decides to present AIIB or One Belt and One Road as a kind of counter to the Bretton Woods system, or as a post-Bretton Woods system or post-West world, I don't think China will be very successful, to be honest.
To be honest, President Xi Jinping says over and over that China has benefited enormously from the existing world economic order. And we want, at most, to improve and to fine-tune the existing order so that it's more open, more inclusive, instead of destroying it or replacing it with something new.
Well, improving it and adjusting it, I think that's a legitimate and important dialogue for China and the United States and Europe and Japan to have. I think that's very important and very legitimate. To keep the Bretton Woods system viable, it has to be effective, but it also has to be appropriately inclusive. And that's a very legitimate
But the issue is
dialogue.
who will be the leader?
Well, you know, we asked that question.
Okay, thank you very much. We keep this question open for the next round of discussion with you.
Very good.
Next time.
Excellent.
And I really welcome you back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to the world today on CGTN. I'm Zhongshi in Beijing. The political crisis between the